There are questions tucked inside every game, woven quietly into the code and dialogue, waiting for someone patient enough to look closely enough to notice. Generation after generation of Pokemon games have accumulated a quiet archive of mysteries, small inconsistencies, and deliberate ambiguities that have kept players thinking long after the credits rolled. The theories that grew out of those mysteries were never officially confirmed, but they carried something compelling, something that felt almost like truth. And before we drift any further, settle in as we begin tonight's relaxing journey through the world of Pokemon. If this helps you unwind, subscribe to join the Cozy Club. There is a theory that has drifted through Pokemon communities for as long as the franchise itself has existed. It concerns two creatures whose similarities feel too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. One is a pink and shape-shifting creature of extraordinary rarity, capable of learning any move ever devised, believed by many researchers within the game's world to be the common ancestor of all Pokemon. The other is a small purple blob with the singular ability to transform itself into a perfect replica of anything it encounters, living and non-living alike. Mew and Ditto share qualities that have always struck careful observers as unusual. Their weights are identical, a detail that feels too specific to be random in a franchise where numerical precision often carries hidden meaning. Their color palettes reflect each other in ways that seem intentional, especially when both are viewed in their alternate, shiny forms. And in all of Pokemon history, across every generation of games ever released, across hundreds of species cataloged and studied, only these two creatures can use the move Transform, a fact so specific it feels like a deliberate signature embedded in the data by someone who wanted a connection to be noticed eventually. The theory that Ditto is a failed clone of Mew begins in Cinnabar Island, a volcanic location where a now ruined laboratory once conducted experiments whose full scope was never officially disclosed. In the original games, Wild Ditto can be found wandering that island with a frequency that seems too significant to ignore. The laboratory on that island was the site where Mewtwo was created, where scientists worked from a recovered sample of Mew's genetic material, attempting to amplify and reshape that ancient DNA into something more controlled, more powerful. The theory suggests that the attempts which preceded Mewtwo's successful creation were not simply discarded, they wandered out. They became something small and purple and confused about their own identity. This theory has never been confirmed by Game Freak, and perhaps it never will be. But what makes it endure is not certainty. It is the feeling it produces, the sense that something very old and very quiet is living among ordinary Pokemon, carrying a memory of what it once almost was. Ditto transforms with perfect mimicry, but if you look at its face while it holds another shape, something imprecise lingers there, something that never quite becomes what it is pretending to be. And that imprecision, that faint wrongness at the edges of every disguise, feels like the most honest detail in the entire theory. The idea that a failed attempt at creating something magnificent would result not in destruction, but in something gentle and endlessly adaptable carries a kind of melancholy that feels very much at home in the world of Pokemon, where even the saddest things are given softness and a place to exist. There are places in the original Kanto games where the world shows you something dark without quite explaining what you are looking at. A rivalry between two young trainers begins simply enough with a moment of competition and the kind of brash confidence that belongs entirely to youth. But something in that rivalry shifts over time, becomes heavier, acquires a weight that the early hours of the game do not prepare you for. In the original Pokemon Red and Blue, your rival begins his journey with a small, ordinary creature, a rat Pokemon, unremarkable, the kind of thing someone might catch in the first available grass without much deliberation. That creature grows and evolves over the early portions of the game, appearing in battles against you on the SS An, a grand ocean vessel where trainers gather and the world feels large and full of possibility. But when you encounter your rival again after that point, something is different. The evolved rat that accompanied him is gone. There is no explanation offered, no dialogue acknowledging the absence. Your rival simply appears without the creature that had been so consistently part of his team. And the next time you see him, after that quiet disappearance, he is standing in Lavender Town, inside a tower built for a single purpose. Lavender Town's Pokemon Tower is a place of mourning, a location where trainers bring the spirits of their fallen companions, where memorial stones stand in rows, and the air carries a weight that is unlike anywhere else in the Kanto region. It is not the kind of place a confident young rival visits for strategic reasons. It is the kind of place that someone goes when they have experienced something that changed them. And the theory suggests that what changed your rival was a battle he could not walk away from cleanly, a defeat from which his most familiar companion never recovered. The theory that your rival's Raticate died in the battle on the SS and has persisted because it transforms something that might have been a simple continuity oversight into a piece of quiet tragedy. It suggests that the battles in Pokemon are not purely abstract, not merely a system of numbers and move selections, but events with consequences that ripple outward. It suggests that your rival's journey was shadowed by a loss he never speaks about, because the game does not give him words for it, only a location and a silence that speaks more clearly than any dialogue could. Whether the absence was intentional or accidental is something only the developers could confirm. But the interpretation has become part of how players experience those early games, a reminder that the world of Pokemon contains depths that its colorful surface does not always advertise. Another quiet thread runs through the Pokemon anime, one that has occupied the imaginations of viewers for decades. The world of the anime presents its protagonist as a 10-year-old boy at the beginning of his journey, accompanied by a reluctant electric companion and driven by a kind of boundless enthusiasm that feels genuine and uncomplicated. But the world around that boy contains gaps, absences so consistent they begin to feel deliberate. The father of Ash Ketchum is never shown, never named in any meaningful way, and only ever referred to, in the vaguest terms, as someone who is on his own Pokemon journey, a justification that explains nothing and satisfies nobody. The absence of this figure stretches across the entirety of the anime's original run and into its subsequent series without ever being addressed with any real directness. And that persistent silence has led fans to fill it with their own theories, some whimsical and some surprisingly structured. The most widely discussed theory connects Ash's missing father to Giovanni, the leader of Team Rocket, a figure who operates from behind the scenes as the primary antagonist of the Kanto saga and whose motivations are never entirely clear. The theory points to a pattern that is difficult to explain away. Team Rocket's dedicated pursuit of Ash throughout the anime is framed as an obsession with capturing Pikachu, but the execution of that pursuit is remarkably ineffective for an organization that is otherwise portrayed as ruthless and resourceful. Jesse and James, the operatives assigned to follow Ash across entire regions, fail so consistently and so completely that their failure begins to look less like incompetence and more like a different kind of instruction. They never seriously harm Ash. They never succeed in taking him out of the picture despite having ample opportunity. The theory suggests that their assignment was never really about Pikachu at all, but about maintaining a watchful distance, keeping a parent's eye on a child from a position that permitted no direct contact. This theory requires a certain kind of imagination to fully inhabit, a willingness to read the show's silliest recurring gag as something that was always carrying a different meaning underneath. But that kind of layered reading is exactly what Pokemon has always rewarded, a franchise built on surfaces that conceal depths, on designs that tell stories in their shapes and names and silences. The missing father is one of those silences, and what fills it says something about how the audience has always wanted this world to mean more than it shows. There is a Pokemon from the Unova region whose very nature seems constructed to invite a particular kind of reading. His name is N, and he appears first as an enigmatic figure who speaks to Pokemon as easily as other humans speak to each other, whose understanding of the creatures he advocates for is so complete it feels less like empathy and more like direct comprehension. He is, by every outward measure, a human being with unusual gifts and an unusual history. But the theory that N is not human at all, that what players encounter throughout the black and white games is an illusion maintained by a creature capable of perfect transformation, has circulated in Pokemon communities with remarkable persistence. The creature in question is Zoroark, a dark-type Pokemon whose defining ability is the power to create elaborate illusions indistinguishable from reality, not merely taking the appearance of other Pokemon, but of human beings as well, a detail that the games establish explicitly. The similarities between N and Zoroark extend beyond the theoretical. Their hair shares a visual quality, an untamed waviness that appears in both the character design of N and in Zoroark's cascading mane. N's ability to understand Pokemon speech could be interpreted as the natural result of being a Pokemon oneself, an entity for whom the distinction between human and creature has never existed. And in the post-game of Black and White 2, a Zoroark leads players through a cave to N's castle before vanishing at the moment of arrival, as if the guide and the destination were never two separate things. This theory is compelling, not because it makes the story of Black and White more dramatic, but because it makes it more tender. N's entire arc concerns the question of whether Pokemon and humans can understand each other, whether the boundary between them is one of kind or merely of language and attention. If N himself occupies both sides of that boundary, if he is in some sense the answer to the very question he is asking, then his story becomes something complete in a way that no dialogue box could make it. A question about two very different Pokemon has generated one of the more anatomically interesting theories in the franchise's long history. It concerns a ghost-type Pokemon shaped like a grinning shadow, and a normal-type Pokemon shaped like a fairy in a pink ball gown. At first glance, they share nothing beyond the general humanoid outline that appears in many Pokemon designs. But look more carefully, and the parallels become difficult to dismiss. The body proportions of Gengar and Clefable mirror each other with a precision that seems designed rather than accidental. Both have rounded bodies, pointed ears rising from their heads, spines that curve in similar ways, and a general silhouette that could, if viewed in shadow, be mistaken for the other. They appear in some readings to be the same shape described in two different registers, one full of color and warm expression, one emptied of color and cold around the edges. The theory proposes that Gengar and Clefable represent a single form in two states, one living and one dead, one occupying the world of the ordinary, and one occupying the world of ghosts. Normal type and ghost type exist at opposite poles of Pokemon's type system, the most mundane and the most spectral, the most rooted in everyday existence, and the most detached from it. The theory reads that opposition as intentional, a visual argument built into the designs themselves. Game Freak has never confirmed or denied this reading, and the evidence remains entirely visual, requiring an interpretive leap that the games themselves do not explicitly support. But the visual evidence is striking enough that it has persisted for decades, and there is something in the image it creates that feels significant. The idea that every living thing casts a shadow of itself into death, that somewhere in the spectral world there is a shape that matches your own, is not a cheerful thought. But it is a very old thought, and Pokemon has always been more comfortable with old thoughts than it sometimes appears. The world of Pokemon is one in which history is only ever partially visible, disclosed in fragments through Pokedex entries and old men in buildings, and the rare piece of landscape that seems to carry memory in its stones. But there is one fragment, offered almost in passing in the original Kanto games, that has generated more interpretive energy than almost anything else in the franchise. In Vermilion City, inside a gymnasium heavy with fluorescent light and the smell of old battles, there is a trainer who holds a rank and a history. He speaks briefly about having survived something, about having learned the value of what he carries through an experience that the games do not name directly. He uses the word war. He does not elaborate. The moment passes, the battle begins. And players have been thinking about that word ever since. The theory of the Pokemon War attempts to fill in the blank that this moment creates, constructing a history for the Kanto region that explains several details which otherwise resist explanation. The most frequently cited detail is the absence of fathers. In the original Red and Blue, almost no adult male figures with young families are visible anywhere in the Kanto landscape. The protagonist's father is absent. The rival's father is absent. The world is populated primarily by women raising children alone and old men who carry the particular stillness of people who have outlasted something terrible. The theory suggests that a generation of men was lost to a conflict that ended perhaps a decade before the games begin, close enough that its effects are still visible in the demographics of every town, far enough that children born during it are now old enough to carry their own Pokeballs into the tall grass. The war would explain why someone like the Vermilion gym leader carries his particular philosophy about survival, why he seems to have learned things in a context that goes beyond competitive battling, why his words carry a weight that a simple gym leader's dialogue usually does not. This theory cannot be confirmed because the games have never confirmed it, and likely never will. But it does something valuable regardless of its factual status. It invites players to read the Kanto region as a place with a past, a location that was shaped by things that happened before the game's opening, and that carries those events in its landscape and its silences. Every empty house and every woman sitting alone in a town that should have more people in it becomes, through the lens of this theory, a small memorial. A world still living in the aftermath of something it has not yet named. There is a mythical Pokemon from the Kalos region whose existence raises questions about deep time and the strangeness of survival across hundreds of millions of years. Genesect is an ancient insect, a creature from an era of the world so remote that the very concept of species, as we understand them, had not yet fully stabilized. It was discovered and then altered, given a mechanical canon that should not belong on something organic, a fusion of ancient biology and modern engineering that creates an unease in anyone who considers it too carefully. The theory connecting Genesect to Kabutops requires a willingness to consider what paleontology looks like in a world where the creatures described by fossil records can be restored to living tissue. In that world, comparisons between ancient species carry weight they do not carry in ours. And Genesect and Kabutops, when placed side by side, carry a great deal of weight. Their body structures share qualities that feel less like parallel evolution and more like descent, or perhaps like deliberate reference in the designer's choices. Both creatures occupied the same ecological role in their respective ancient environments. Both were hunters, described in their Pokédex entries as among the most feared predators of their eras. Both moved with a speed and precision that placed them at the top of whatever food hierarchy their ancient world maintained. And both lived, according to the in-game data attached to their entries, approximately 300 million years ago, a coincidence of timing precise enough to feel like it is trying to tell you something. The steel typing of genesect, the theory argues, is not a consequence of natural evolution, but of modification. Team Plasma took something organic and ancient and rewrote its surface, giving it materials that would not have existed in any natural context, creating a creature that is simultaneously 300 million years old and entirely contemporary in its construction. The theory suggests that what Team Plasma found was not a generic ancient insect, but a specific ancestral form, one connected to the lineage that would eventually produce the fossil Pokemon players can already encounter and revive through ordinary gameplay. This theory has the quality of a story that feels right in ways that outrun the available evidence, a reading that fits so many details so cleanly that it produces the particular satisfaction of things clicking into place. Whether or not it reflects the intentions of the people who designed these creatures, it illuminates something about the way Pokemon's world is constructed, a world where deep time is not abstract, but present and tactile, where what lived in the ancient past walks alongside the contemporary present in ways that deserve careful attention. The relationship between Cubone and Kangaskhan is one of the more structurally curious puzzles that the original Kanto games left embedded in their data. It begins with a simple observation about appearance, that the baby Kangaskhan carries in its pouch bears a resemblance to a young Cubone that seems too deliberate to be purely coincidental. Both are small, both have a similar basic anatomy, and both exist in geographical proximity within the game world, appearing in overlapping locations in ways that suggest a connection the games have never made explicit. Cubone's Pokédex entries are among the most consistently melancholy in the franchise. They describe a creature who wears the skull of its deceased mother, who cries for that mother in the night, whose most defining visual characteristic is a grief made literal and worn on its head. This is an unusual degree of narrative specificity for a creature whose lore is never expanded into a full story within the main games. The detail exists, and then it sits there, waiting. The theory proposes that what Cubone is mourning is not a generic maternal figure, but a very specific one, and that the skull it wears is the skull of a Kangaskhan. This would mean that Cubone is in some sense a baby Kangaskhan who survived the loss of the creature that would have otherwise carried and protected it, that grief transformed not merely the emotional state of the creature, but its entire trajectory of development, sending it down a different evolutionary path from the one it would have followed under other circumstances. This interpretation would make Cubone and Marowak not a separate species from Kangaskhan, but a divergent form, shaped by a specific kind of early loss into something that looks different from what it might have been. It is a theory that asks whether grief itself can be an evolutionary pressure, whether the same creature raised in safety and the same creature raised in the aftermath of a devastating loss might become, over enough generations, genuinely different things. The games have provided details that seem to support this reading, including moments in the Sun and Moon games where wild Cubone will call for the assistance of a Kangaskhan in battle, a behavior that suggests some form of kinship or recognition between the two species. But the theory has never been confirmed, and there are details in the games that complicate it in ways that prevent a clean resolution. What remains is the resonance of the idea, the way it takes something already sad and makes it feel like part of a larger story about how loss shapes living things. The question of why Ash Ketchum does not age has occupied Pokemon viewers for the entire run of the original anime and well into its sequel series. He begins his journey at 10 years old. He ends journeys at 10 years old. He travels through regions, accumulates experience, achieves things that would take most humans years of dedicated work, and then starts again in a new place at the same age, as if time is a river that flows around him without touching him. The explanation the anime has occasionally gestured at without ever committing to is that time in the Pokemon world simply passes differently than it does in ours, that the events of the series occupy a compressed or otherwise unusual temporal space. This explanation is functional but unsatisfying because it turns what feels like a meaningful detail into a production choice with no story behind it. The theory that draws on Ho-Oh is more interesting. In the very first episode of the anime, before Ash has done anything at all to distinguish himself, before he has caught a single Pokemon or won a single badge, he looks up at the sky and sees something he is not supposed to see, a rainbow-colored bird of impossible size passing overhead in the light of a sunset. The moment is brief. Ash cannot be entirely sure what he witnessed, but the Pokédex entry for Ho-Oh states clearly that anyone who sees it is promised eternal happiness, a blessing that the games and anime treat as a genuine property of the encounter. The theory argues that eternal happiness and eternal youth are not separable, that the encounter with Ho-Oh did not merely promise Ash a good feeling, but granted him a form of perpetual continuation, a stasis in which he would always be young enough to continue his journey, always 10 years old and always just beginning, because beginning is where his happiness lives. The blessing would not be one he chose or could refuse. It would simply be the consequence of having looked at the right part of the sky on the right morning. This reading transforms Ash's permanent youth from a production convenience into a mythological condition, one that connects the ordinary details of a children's anime to something much older and stranger. It suggests that his entire journey takes place under a promise made before he understood what promises meant, that every region he crosses and every victory and loss he accumulates is happening inside a kind of blessed time that will not run out because it was never meant to. There is a water-type Pokemon whose name contains a secret and whose body may or may not contain the secret it is named for. Wobbuffet is a creature defined by its ability to absorb attacks and counter them, a passive-aggressive battler that frustrates opponents through endurance rather than aggression. Its large blue body wobbles when struck. Its expression is fixed in a kind of determined neutrality. But there is another part of Wobbuffet that receives far less attention than the blue body, partly because Wobbuffet spends considerable effort making sure that less attention is exactly what it receives. The tail is small and black and sits at the back of Wobbuffet's body, and the Pokédex makes a point of telling you that Wobbuffet tries desperately to keep this tail hidden. If you attack the tail, Wobbuffet will become aggressive in a way it never becomes when its main body is targeted, using Destiny Bond to ensure that whatever defeats, it does not walk away cleanly. This disproportionate protectiveness is the seed of the theory. The theory proposes that the blue body of Wobbuffet is not where Wobbuffet actually lives, but is a kind of decoy, a lure designed to draw attention away from the tail where Wobbuffet's true self resides. The blue body is the disguise, the tail is the creature. And the reason Wobbuffet goes to such lengths to protect the tail is not merely territorial instinct, but something closer to survival at a fundamental level, the protection of the self from those who would mistake the performance of self for the real thing. A secondary thread within this theory connects Wobbuffet's tail to the unknown, a group of Pokemon shaped like letters and said to possess a kind of collective power when gathered in large enough numbers, but individually quite helpless. The tale's visual design resembles the shape of an Unone, and the theory extends from there into territory that requires more interpretive generosity than most are willing to extend. But the first part of the theory, the idea that Wobbuffet is a living misdirection, a creature whose most visible feature is its least essential one, has a quality that feels consistent with the world of Pokemon, where appearances almost never tell the whole story. The legendary beasts that run through the tall grass of Johto, barely glimpsed before they vanish again, carry a history that the games explain in fragments. Before they ran, they burned. Before they burned, they were ordinary Pokemon sleeping in a tower that the world had decided was large enough to be sacred, old enough to be trusted, permanent enough to last. The tower did not last. Something caught fire in it, in circumstances the games describe as ambiguous, and three creatures who had done nothing except exist in the wrong place at the wrong time were gone. Ho-Oh came afterward. Ho-Oh, whose appearance grants eternal happiness to anyone who witnesses it, whose nature seems oriented entirely toward restoration and resurrection, reached down into whatever the tower had become and returned something to those three creatures. What came back was not quite what had gone in. It was something more, something shaped by the manner of its death and the power of its revival, something that would spend its reborn existence in motion, difficult to approach, impossible to hold still. Raikou carries lightning and moves with the speed of storms. Entei breathes fire and represents the eruption of the very flames that killed it, transformed from destruction into something more complex. Suicune runs on the surface of water and purifies it as it passes, an association with cleansing and clarity that may speak to what it was before. These associations are the foundation for the theory about what the three beasts were originally. The theory proposes that the creatures who died in the Brass Tower were already familiar to players, that they were Jolteon, Flareon, and Vaporeon, the electric, fire, and water evolutions of Eevee. The typing correspondences are exact. Jolteon for Raikou, Flareon for Entei, Vaporeon for Suicune. The body shapes are roughly comparable, carrying the feline and canine qualities that the beasts share with the evolution line. And there is a thematic elegance to the idea that Eevee, a Pokemon defined by its potential to become many things, would have had three of its forms present at the moment when becoming something new was the only way to survive. This theory has never been confirmed, and the games offer very little direct evidence beyond the type correspondences and the general visual similarities. But it has circulated for decades in Pokemon communities because it produces a satisfying completeness, a sense that the world of Pokemon contains hidden symmetries that reward the patient observer with connections that feel less like accidents and more like design. There is a truck in Vermilion City that sits near the dock where the SS On departs, parked in a location that most players will pass through exactly once and never think about again. It is a large truck, and it is simply there, occupying space in a way that feels vaguely purposeful without ever becoming clearly meaningful. Under ordinary circumstances, it is not accessible. The path that would lead a player to examine it closely requires a specific combination of Pokemon moves and a specific sequence of decisions made on the ship that seems designed to prevent that examination rather than facilitate it. The theory that something lies beneath that truck began in the earliest days of the franchise and reached a scale of circulation that transformed it from a speculation into a piece of shared cultural history. The specific something was Mew, the mythical Pokemon who was already rare and strange and associated with origins and secrets in ways that made its alleged presence under a vehicle in a dock city feel almost plausible. What makes this theory unusual among Pokemon theories is not its content, but its reception. Game Freak eventually acknowledged it, not by confirming it, but by placing Easter eggs in subsequent games that reference the truck and the rumor in ways that are affectionate rather than dismissive. In the Fire Red and Leaf Green remakes, players who manage to reach the truck find a lava cookie hidden beneath it, a nod to the theory's persistence without any validation of its premise. In the Let's Go games, the truck yields a revive. The joke is there, gentle and knowing, a wink from the developers to a community that had spent years treating a loading dock prop as the location of something sacred. There is something worth sitting with in that dynamic, the way a rumor so obviously false became so beloved that its falseness was eventually commemorated rather than corrected. The truck with nothing under it became more interesting than a truck with Mew under it would have been, because the absence is what the community filled with imagination, and imagination is what has always made Pokemon feel larger than any individual game could contain. The truck is empty. The truck is legendary. These two things coexist without contradiction in the particular logic of Pokemon, where what players believe a thing to be is as real as what the thing actually is. Another detail in the fabric of Pokemon that has generated quiet, persistent examination is the question of what Pokemon once were before they were what they are now. The franchise has always been interested in deep time, in creatures whose existence stretches back through geological eras to periods when the world looked nothing like it currently does. Fossil Pokemon in every generation have offered a window into this prehistoric layer, presenting ancient creatures restored from stone and bone into living tissue by contemporary technology. The earliest fossil Pokemon, Kabuto and Omanyte, in their evolved forms, established a template for how the franchise would handle deep time. They were presented as genuinely ancient, as creatures from a period so remote that their existence in the present feels slightly wrong, slightly out of place, like objects in a room that belong to a different house. Kabutops in particular carries this feeling sharply. It is a predator shaped by a world that no longer exists, a hunter whose efficiency and speed were honed in conditions that have not been replicated in hundreds of millions of years. It moves through the present world like a memory. The question of how the ancient and the contemporary relate to each other in Pokemon is one that the games have returned to many times without ever fully resolving. Every fossilized Pokemon raised to new life is also a creature displaced in time, experiencing a present that is entirely foreign to every instinct it possesses. The theoretical connections between ancient and contemporary forms, the suggestions that something like Kabutops might be ancestral to something like Genesect, or that the ancient world might have contained precursors to types and lineages that still exist in the contemporary roster, speak to something the franchise clearly finds interesting. The world of Pokemon contains time in multiple layers, all of them accessible if you know where to look. The fossil record, the ancient ruins scattered across every region, the Pokemon that have persisted unchanged across geological time, through means the games never fully explain. All of these are invitations to ask what the world looked like before the moment the games begin, to imagine the long, unnarrated history that produced every species players encounter in the present. There is a connection between two Pokemon in the Kanto region that has become one of the more structurally complex theories in the franchise's history, because it requires players to hold multiple pieces of lore in mind simultaneously and observe the way they fit together into something that was never stated but may have always been intended. The ghost that haunts the Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town is eventually revealed. Players who encounter it are initially unable to interact with it, unable to pass through the tower at all without finding a specific item that allows them to see and communicate with what is waiting for them in the upper levels. When the ghost is finally visible, when its story is finally told through the limited vocabulary the games provide, what is there is a Marowak, and what is behind it is a loss. Marowak is Cubone's evolved form, the creature Cubone becomes after it has grown through its grief, rather than simply endured it. The ghost in the tower died before that evolution could happen, died still wearing the skull that marked its mourning, died in circumstances connected to Team Rocket's operations in Lavender Town, whose full scope the games suggest, but never entirely disclose. It was killed, essentially, by the organization that also haunts the tower in its own way, using the location's solemnity as cover for activities that have nothing to do with mourning. Well, what this reveals, in combination with the Cubone Kangaskhan theory, is a picture of a grief that passes between generations, that the skull Cubone wears may be the skull of a creature who was itself grieving when it died, who was itself a Cubone that never became what it was trying to become, who now haunts the place designated for the dead and waits for something that the games never promise will come. Whether this layering of loss was designed or accumulated, whether it reflects a coherent authorial intention or a series of coincidences that happen to rhyme with each other, is impossible to say. But it produces something that feels significant, a picture of how grief can become a material inheritance passed from parent to child in the most literal possible way. The Pokemon Black and White games introduced a region built around a particular question, whether the relationship between Pokemon and human beings is one of partnership or exploitation, whether the structures that seem like cooperation might in fact be something more troubling. The question was posed primarily through characters with extreme views, and then complicated by the player's own position within a system that the games ask them to both participate in and examine. N's arc through those games is one of the more structurally interesting character journeys in the franchise's history. He begins as someone who believes, with total conviction, that Pokemon and humans should be separated for the good of Pokemon, that the bondage of being caught and trained and battled is harm, regardless of how willing or content the Pokemon involved appear to be. He ends somewhere more complicated, having encountered evidence that challenges his original certainty without destroying his capacity and to care about the question. The theory that N is himself a Pokemon using Zoroark's illusion abilities is interesting precisely because of what it would mean for this arc. If N is a Pokemon experiencing human society from the inside, presenting as human in order to move through a world that would otherwise be inaccessible to him, then his advocacy is not the position of an outsider who empathizes with the exploited, but the position of someone who has experienced both sides of the boundary he is arguing against. His ability to speak with Pokemon would not be a gift or a learned skill, but simply the native language of the self he is concealing. And his uncertainty at the end of the games, his inability to fully commit to the separation he began by advocating for, would carry a different weight. It would be the uncertainty of someone who has lived as both things and cannot find a clean position because no clean position exists for someone who is both. The theory cannot be confirmed, and the games provide no explicit validation of it, but it enriches an already interesting narrative with an additional layer, and the best Pokemon theories have always been the ones that do not simply add a fact, but change the way you understand what was already there. The Pokemon world contains many small mysteries that exist at a scale below the major theories, details that are too specific to be accidental, but too subtle to generate the kind of sustained community discussion that the larger theories attract. These details accumulate over the course of any careful playthrough into a picture of a world that was built by people paying close attention to what they were building, embedding meanings into places where most players would never look. Professor Oak, the first authority figure the games introduce, is presented as a renowned Pokemon researcher whose knowledge is extensive and whose position at the gateway of the player's journey is partly functional and partly symbolic. He is there to explain the world. He is there to give you the tools you need. He is also there, in the theories of certain close readers, to represent something more complicated. His grandson, the rival, bears his name and his competitiveness. His lab contains the creatures that begin every Kanto journey. His entire existence is oriented toward sending young people out into a world he seems to have already explored as thoroughly as it can be explored. The detail that Pokemon lore sometimes uses to complicate the picture of Professor Oak is his Pokédex, the device he gives to the player at the beginning of the game with instructions to fill it by catching and cataloging every species in Kanto. The Pokédex, at the start of the game, contains no data. It knows nothing. The question the theory asks is why a renowned Pokemon researcher, someone who has spent his life studying these creatures, would give a 10-year-old a device designed to record information he himself does not already possess. One answer is that he is curious. Another is that he cannot go himself, that something about his circumstances or his age prevents him from doing what he is sending others to do. And a third answer, offered less frequently, is that he already has his own filled Pokédex somewhere, and what he is asking the player to do is not to discover something he does not know, but to rediscover it, to confirm or revise a record he made long ago when he was young enough to walk into tall grass without hesitation. This reading turns the entire framing of the Kanto games into something slightly different, a repetition rather than a discovery, an echo of a journey that was made before the player existed, by someone who is now standing still and watching others do what he once did. It does not make the journey less meaningful. If anything, it makes it more so, because it places the player's adventure within a lineage of adventures, a series of young people sent out to walk through the same tall grass and arrive eventually at the same stadium, carrying their own version of a completed record. The question of what Pokemon are at a fundamental level is one that the franchise has circled without ever fully addressing. They are creatures clearly, in the biological sense, born and living and dying, eating and sleeping, forming attachments and carrying memories. But they are also something more difficult to categorize, entities that channel elemental forces in ways that no purely biological framework can explain, that sometimes appear to be as much idea as animal. Psychic types occupy a particularly strange space within this question. They are Pokemon who interact with the world primarily through forces that are mental rather than physical, who perceive things that ordinary senses cannot reach, who sometimes seem to exist slightly sideways from the present moment, touching times and spaces that are adjacent to the immediate. Their Pokédex entries are among the most consistently unsettling in the franchise, describing in calm, matter-of-fact language abilities that would be world-altering if they were real. Alakazam is described as having an intelligence that surpasses any human who has ever lived, a memory so complete that it retains every experience from birth onward without loss or distortion, an IQ that the Pokédex measures in numbers that place it beyond any meaningful human comparison. These claims are offered without emphasis, tucked into entry text that also mentions its preference for using spoons as focal points for its psychic energy, as if both pieces of information are equivalent in importance. The casual delivery of extraordinary claims is one of Pokemon's most consistent stylistic choices, and it has the effect of making the world feel both grander and stranger than any individual moment of gameplay can fully convey. The theories that cluster around psychic Pokemon and their abilities ask questions about what it would mean to share a world with entities of this kind, what the implied relationship between human intelligence and Pokemon intelligence actually is, whether the trainer who controls Alakazam in battle is truly in control in any meaningful sense. These questions do not have answers in the games, but their presence gives the world of Pokemon a philosophical depth that exceeds what a game about collecting and battling should contain. And that excess is part of what has made the franchise hold so many people's imaginations for so long. There is a dimension within the Pokemon world that the games have approached with unusual caution, a space they have named without fully explaining, referenced without fully exploring, acknowledged without fully committing to. The Distortion World, introduced in the Sinnoh region's games, is a place that exists outside the normal rules of the Pokemon world's physics, where gravity is negotiable and directions lose their usual meaning, and the being who inhabits it is ancient in a way that makes the word ancient feel insufficient. Giratina is the Pokemon who lives there, banished to it, according to the game's mythology, for violence in an era before the world, as it currently exists, was finalized. It was sent away from the world at the moment of creation and became the ruler of the space outside of creation, the inverted landscape that the game presents as the shadow of reality rather than its absence. Everything that exists in the normal world appears there in some form, distorted and rearranged but present, suggesting that the Distortion World is not nothing but a different kind of something, a mirror with different rules. The theories about Giratina ask questions about what banishment means in a cosmological context, what it would feel like to be removed from reality itself and placed in its inversion, whether the violence that caused the banishment was an act of destruction or an act of a different kind of will that the world's creator could not accommodate. Some readings of Giratina are sympathetic in ways the games don't explicitly invite, presenting the ruler of the Distortion World not as a villain, but as the first and most complete exile, the Pokemon that knows more than any other about what the world looks like from outside. The cosmology of the Sinnoh region is the most explicitly developed in the franchise, offering a creation myth complete with a god and a hierarchy of forces and a moment of origin that the games describe with unusual directness. Giratina exists at the edge of that cosmology, neither fully inside the creation story nor outside it, occupying the space that every cosmological system requires but few are willing to map directly. The theories that explore Giratina are, in a sense, exploring what any serious cosmological framework must eventually confront: the question of what exists at the edges of the story being told, and what it means that the story cannot accommodate everything. The question of memory in Pokemon, of what creatures remember and how they carry that memory, is one that the franchise has touched in many places without ever treating as a central concern. Individual Pokemon are identified by nicknames and personality statistics and the record of their origin, but the question of whether a Pokemon remembers its own life, accumulates experience in a way that persists and shapes its character over time, is one that the games leave productively open. The Slowpoke evolutionary line has generated some of the more interesting thinking about memory and time in the Pokemon world, because everything about Slowpoke seems designed to raise questions about the relationship between perception and reality. Slowpoke is famously slow to register pain, so slow that the delay between the stimulus and the response can be measured in minutes rather than moments. It sits at the water's edge with its tail dangling and seems to think thoughts that take longer than ordinary thinking, as if its internal time runs at a different speed from the world around it. The theory that Slowpoke is not actually slow, but is perceiving something that faster-moving creatures cannot access, that its apparent torpor is in fact a form of attention directed at something the rest of the world moves too quickly to notice, has an appealing quality. It suggests that the hierarchy implicit in the name, the assumption that being slow to respond is simply a deficiency, might be missing something. What Slowpoke is slow at is not perception, but reaction. What it perceives might be more than faster creatures are capable of perceiving. The trade-off, if it is a trade-off, might be less obvious than the name suggests. Slowbro, the evolution triggered by a shelter's bite, adds another layer to this thinking. The creature that attached itself to Slowpoke's tail is apparently absorbed into a symbiosis that benefits both organisms, with Shelter providing the biochemical compound that triggers a Slowbro's psychic development, and Slowbro providing the body that Shelter inhabits. The result is a Pokemon that is simultaneously two creatures and one that carries its own history visibly on its tail, that achieved its evolution through an accident and wears the evidence of that accident permanently. One of the longest running and most quietly unsettling areas of Pokemon theory concerns what happens when a trainer loses all their Pokemon in battle, the event the games describe with the neutral language of blacking out an address by returning the player to the last Pokemon Center they visited. This reset is presented as a purely mechanical feature, a way to prevent game over states and keep the player's progress largely intact. But the calmness of the presentation has always drawn attention. The player does not lose anything permanent when they black out. Their money decreases. They find themselves in a familiar location. Everything continues. The theory asks what, within the logic of the game world, is actually being described when this happens. It asks whether the blacking out is purely a player-side event, or whether it corresponds to something in the world the player is inhabiting. And it arrives, in some of its more elaborate forms, at a suggestion that the game world is maintained by something external to the player's own experience, something that intervenes to restore the situation to a recoverable state when things go wrong beyond a certain threshold. This reading is less a theory about specific Pokemon lore and more a reflection on the philosophical strangeness of existing inside a game world, on the question of what happens when the rules that make the experience possible become visible rather than transparent. The blacking out moment is one of those times when the game's scaffolding shows through, when the machinery becomes briefly legible, and the interpretive instinct that has always characterized the Pokemon community turns that visibility into a question rather than an answer. The most interesting Pokemon theories have always been the ones that take something the games present as purely functional, a mechanic, a number, a detail in a menu, and ask what it means within the world, rather than simply what it does in the game. The richness of the interpretive tradition around Pokemon is partly a consequence of the franchise's design philosophy, which has always embedded more meaning than it announces, but it is also a consequence of the community that grew up with these games and found in them a world worth reading carefully. There is a Pokemon in the original Kanto games that has generated more unsettled analysis than almost any other, not because of theories about its origins or connections to other creatures, but because of what its Pokédex entries actually say about it and what those entries might mean if taken seriously. Hypno is a psychic type, modeled on the folklore figure of the hypnotist, carrying a pendulum, inducing sleep in those around it. Its entries describe its behavior in terms that are difficult to make comfortable within the aesthetic of a children's franchise. The entries describe Hypno seeking out sleeping humans, describe the quality of the dreams it induces as something that has not always ended well for the dreamers, describe a pattern of behavior that reads, in the most direct interpretation, as predatory in ways that the games are not willing to name, but unwilling to fully conceal. This has led to theories about what Hypno actually is in the mythology of the Pokemon world, whether it occupies a role in that world's folklore similar to the role its inspiration occupies in ours, whether the towns and cities of Kanto understand what is in their forests in a way that the game's surface presentation does not quite capture. The town associated most consistently with this theorizing is Lavender Town, not because Hypno appears there specifically, but because Lavender Town is already the location in Kanto where the world's willingness to acknowledge difficult things is at its highest. It is the place where death is named and where the games slow down and become quieter. The theories about Hypno become most elaborate in the context of this region precisely because the region itself is already oriented toward things that children's media usually avoids, and within that orientation, the implications of Hypno's entries feel more present rather than more remote. What these theories share with the broader tradition of Pokemon analysis is an attention to the gap between what the games say and what they mean, the space between the matter-of-fact language of a Pokédex entry and the implications of that entry when read carefully. That gap is where most interesting Pokemon thinking happens, and Hypno's entries are one of the places where the gap is widest, where the surface and the depth are furthest apart. As the evening grows quiet, and the details of these theories begin to settle into something softer, it is worth sitting for a moment with what the entire tradition of Pokemon theorizing represents. For more than 2 decades, players have been reading these games, and the anime, and the trading cards, and the films with an attention that exceeds what any entertainment product strictly requires. They have been looking for meanings that were not announced, for connections that were not explained, for the story beneath the story that the franchise has always suggested without ever fully telling. This tradition is not simply a consequence of having nothing better to do with a beloved franchise. It reflects something genuine about what Pokemon is and what it does. The games present a world with extraordinary density, a world that was built by people who cared about it and who embedded their caring in specific ways, in the weight of a creature that matches the weight of its supposed ancestor, in the presence of a tower, in the path of a grieving rival, in the words of a soldier who fought in a war that the game will never describe more fully. These details invite attention. They call out for the particular kind of reading that the Pokemon community has always been willing to offer. And the theories that result are not errors or misreadings or wishful thinking, but genuine acts of engagement with a world that was built to be engaged with, that rewards sustained attention with discoveries that feel like gifts, small recognitions that arrive with the particular satisfaction of noticing something that was always there and always waiting to be noticed. The world of Pokemon is older than it appears on any individual playthrough. It has a history that extends back through multiple geological eras, through the creation of time and space and antimatter by beings whose existence is only gestured at in ruins and myths and the cryptic language of Pokédex entries. It has a present that is always more complicated than any single trainer's experience of it, filled with organizations and researchers and ordinary people living lives the player never directly witnesses. And it has futures, multiple possible futures, some beautiful and some catastrophic, that the games have imagined across their many iterations. The theories that have grown in and around this world are part of the world now, as much as any official game could be. They have shaped how players experience the games, changed what they look for and what they find, added layers of meaning to things that would otherwise remain unmarked. The ghost in Lavender Tower means more because of the theory about the rival. The truck in Vermilion means more because of the myth that grew around it. Ditto means more in every game because of the question about its origins that has never been answered and may never be. What makes this tradition so durable is not any individual theory's correctness or incorrectness, but the quality of attention it requires and produces. To theorize about Pokemon is to look at something you thought you knew and see it differently, to let the familiar become strange for a moment, and then, when you look away, carry the strangeness with you in a way that makes the familiar richer than it was before. There are theories that sit at the edges of the franchise's official canon, neither confirmed nor denied, existing in a space that is productive precisely because it has not been closed. The theory about the origins of the legendary bird trio in Kanto, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres asks questions about what these creatures were before they were legendary, whether their elemental associations were always primary to their nature, or whether they became elemental in the way that the legendary beasts became elemental through some transformation that the games acknowledge without explaining. The three birds appear in locations that match their types with a precision that feels designed. The ice bird in the cavern, the electric bird in the power plant, the fire bird on the volcanic peak. These placements are so clean that they have the quality of an arrangement rather than an ecology, three creatures placed where they belong by someone who knew where each one needed to be. The theory extends from this observation into questions about who did the placing, whether the birds arrived in these locations through their own movement, or were sent there by forces operating at a level the games do not directly address. The legendary structure of Kanto has always been, in the context of the franchise as a whole, relatively simple compared to what later generations introduced. But that simplicity is partly deceptive, because the simplicity of presentation does not preclude complexity of implication. The three birds and their placements and the question of what they are doing there and how long they have been doing it are all questions that the games invite without answering, and the invitation is what the theorizing community has always responded to most enthusiastically. As the night deepens and the theories settle into something restful, the world of Pokemon arranges itself into a shape that is, at its core, about attention. Every theory, every reading, every careful examination of a detail that most players pass through without noticing is an act of sustained care directed at a world that was built by people who were themselves paying careful attention to what they were building. The exchange goes in both directions. The game offers details. The community receives them. The community returns meaning. The world becomes fuller on both ends of the exchange. The theories about Mew and Ditto, about Blue's Raticate, about the war in Kanto, about what Giovanni might be, about where the legendary beast came from, about the nature of Gengar's relationship to the living, about what lies beneath the truck in Vermilion, these are not separate things. They are part of a single tradition of asking what this world is, and what it is for, and what it contains beyond what it announces. And the tradition itself is as much a part of Pokemon's legacy as any game or anime episode, a body of thought built up over decades by people who loved a world enough to read it carefully. The details will keep revealing themselves to anyone who looks with sufficient patience. The gaps between what is said and what is meant will keep generating questions, and the questions will keep producing the particular pleasure of feeling, even in a fictional world, that you have found something that was placed there specifically for you, a small hidden thing that only reveals itself when you are paying exactly the right kind of attention at exactly the right moment. There is a pattern embedded in the geography of the Pokemon world that has drawn careful attention from players who are interested not just in the stories the games tell, but in the spaces those stories inhabit. Every region in the franchise has been designed with an internal logic that extends beyond visual aesthetics into something closer to ecological and historical coherence. The towns and routes and wild spaces of each region are not simply arranged for the convenience of gameplay, though they serve that function. They are arranged to suggest a world that existed before the player arrived and will continue to exist after the player's specific journey through it concludes. Kanto, the first region most players encountered, has a density of suggestion that still rewards careful exploration years after its introduction. The coastal cities, the industrial center, the tower for the dead, the sleeping Pokemon in the power plant, the cave whose darkness is so complete It has its own psychological weight. All of these locations form a picture of a region that has been shaped by history and accident and the particular way human beings and Pokemon have learned to coexist in proximity to each other. The theories that have grown from close attention to Kanto are not simply theories about individual details. They are, at their most ambitious, attempts to understand what kind of world this is and how it became what it is. The question of industrialization is one that Kanto raises quietly. The presence of a working power plant, of cities with names that suggest concrete and steel, of an organization whose ambition is explicitly financial, all of these suggest a region in the process of a particular kind of transformation, moving from something more agrarian and Pokemon-centered towards something more extractive and urban. The theories about the Pokemon War fit neatly into this context, suggesting that the industrialization and the conflict might be related, that the same pressures that were reshaping the economic landscape of the region were also reshaping its demographics and its politics. This reading of Kanto as a region in transition, as a world where the old ways of relating to Pokemon are under pressure from forces that are more interested in power than in partnership, gives the games a texture that their surface does not announce. It makes Team Rocket more than simply a villain organization. It makes them a symptom of something broader, a particular response to the tensions that arise when the world that has always existed and the world that is being built come into conflict. The legendaries that govern the elemental forces of Hoenn have generated theories about the nature of balance and conflict in the Pokemon world that go well beyond the specific story told in Ruby and Sapphire. Groudon and Kyogre, the Pokemon of land and sea, were not always in the state of dormancy the games begin in. Their history involves a battle of such scale that the world as it currently exists is, in some interpretations, the consequence of their last engagement, a landscape shaped by the point at which they finally stopped. The theory that the world's current geography is the result of a compromise, that the ratio of land to water in the Pokemon world reflects not some natural equilibrium, but the specific power balance that existed at the moment Groudon and Kyogre were separated, gives the landscape itself a narrative function. Every coastline is, in this reading, a negotiated boundary. Every ocean is the extent to which Kyogre's influence persisted. Every mountain range is the point to which Groudon's expansion reached before it was matched and stopped. The world as a record of a conflict that is not ended but merely paused. Rayquaza's role as the creature that mediated this conflict adds a dimension to the theory. A being whose domain is the sky, whose power exceeds both the creatures it mediates between, whose relationship to the planet is one of oversight rather than participation. The sky is what both land and sea exist beneath. It is neither. It is above. And the creature who inhabits it and who intervened in the conflict between the two forces below possesses the particular authority of the entity that exists at a remove from what it governs. The theory extends into questions about what would happen if the balance were disturbed, if one force were to gain sufficient advantage over the other. The games address this question directly in their storylines, presenting the scenarios as catastrophic. But the theoretical tradition asks a quieter version of the same question, what the world is always becoming, what the stasis that seems like peace actually is, whether what players experience as the stable world of the games is in fact a fragile equilibrium maintained by the continued dormancy of forces that would, if awakened, rewrite everything. There is a Pokemon that the games have consistently described as a harbinger, a creature whose presence in a location is not incidental but meaningful, whose appearance is tied to events that are larger than the immediate context of any individual battle or encounter. Absol is described in its Pokédex entries as a creature that appears before disasters, that has been blamed for those disasters throughout history by people who confused the messenger with the cause. The theory of Absol as a misunderstood guardian is one that the games themselves essentially invite, presenting the persecution of Absol as a historical error that careful observers have begun to correct. But the theoretical tradition has extended this basic lore in directions that ask deeper questions about what Absol's ability to sense impending disaster actually involves. What kind of perception allows a creature to register events before they become visible? What it would feel like to carry that knowledge in a world that has consistently blamed you for what you were trying to warn. The readings of Absol that find this figure most interesting are those that connect its perceptual abilities to the broader strangeness of Pokemon as entities. Psychic types perceive things that ordinary senses cannot reach. Ghost types exist in a relationship to the world that is mediated through something other than ordinary physicality. And Absol, a dark type despite its role as a warning figure rather than a predator, seems to operate through a form of sensitivity that the games gesture at without fully explaining. What it is sensitive to, how that sensitivity works at a mechanistic level, whether the awareness of coming disaster involves something analogous to ordinary sensory experience or something categorically different, these are questions the Pokédex raises and the games never answer. What the community has done with these questions is characteristic of the broader tradition of Pokemon theorizing, treating the gap between what is said and what is meant as an invitation rather than an oversight. Absol's entries so describe a relationship to time that makes the creature simultaneously present and futureward, experiencing the current moment while already registering something that has not yet happened. The theories that explore this aspect of Absol's nature are, in their way, theories about time as much as theories about Pokemon, about what it would mean to perceive the world with a horizon that extends beyond the present. The ghost types of the original Kanto games remain among the most theorized creatures in the franchise's history, partly because of the ambiguity of their presentation, and partly because of the way their type's lore intersects with questions that the games do not typically raise. Gengar, Haunter, and Ghastly exist in a relationship to the world that is different from the relationship of ordinary Pokemon. They are not simply creatures with unusual abilities. They are entities whose connection to the material world is partial, whose existence in it is in some sense voluntary or contingent, who could presumably choose to be elsewhere. The question of what ghost types are at an ontological level has generated theories ranging from the straightforward to the genuinely strange. The most conservative theories treat them as ordinary Pokemon who happen to be invisible and to interact with the world through unconventional means. The more speculative theories treat them as something closer to what the word ghost implies in ordinary usage, as the residues of creatures who died and remained, whose connection to the world they knew in life has not fully dissolved. If ghost Pokemon are in some sense the remnants of once living creatures, the question of which creatures they were becomes interesting. Gengar, whose shape so closely matches Clefable's, could be interpreted as the ghost of a Clefable, or of something that looked like a Clefable before the dying changed it. Haunter, intermediate between the incorporeal Ghastly and the more solidly present Gengar, would be a stage in a process, a form becoming something with more definition, accumulating the particular character that death gives things. This reading turns the ghost evolutionary line into a narrative about a particular kind of transition, and the battles players have with ghost types into something more complex than they might otherwise appear. The game mechanics that govern ghost types add their own layer to this thinking. Ghost moves pass through normal and fighting type defenses as if those defenses are not there. Normal type moves cannot touch ghost types at all, a mutual immunity that the theory of Gengar as a dead Clefable makes symmetrically interesting. In life, normal type. In death, invisible to normal type. The border between the living and the dead, drawn in the mechanics of the type system itself, a line that cannot be crossed from either side. There is a theory about the Sinnoh creation myth that has occupied a particular space in Pokemon theorizing for years, because it asks a question that the games themselves seem to raise without resolving. Where's the line between mythology and history in the Pokemon world? In ordinary reality, that distinction is clear. Myths are stories that explain the world. History is the record of what actually happened. But in a world where the entities described in myths are also entities that players can encounter and capture in Pokeballs, the distinction becomes unstable. Arceus is presented in the games as the creator of the Pokemon world, the entity that existed before existence, and whose movement brought everything else into being. The Diamond and Pearl games present this not as a myth, but as something accessible in the present, something you can witness and interact with, and in the game's logic, do battle with. The creator of everything can be caught in a Pokeball. The entity responsible for the existence of the universe can be added to your party. The theories that find this most interesting are not the ones that dwell on the absurdity of the mechanic, but the ones that take it seriously and ask what it implies. If Arceus can be encountered by an ordinary trainer, what is Arceus doing in the world? Why is it accessible in the present rather than absent in whatever pre-creation state the myth describes as its origin? One reading suggests that Arceus is perpetually present in the world it created, maintaining it through active ongoing will rather than having set it in motion and stepped back. Another reading suggests that the Arceus players encounter is not the creator in its full aspect, but a manifestation of it, an interface rather than the thing itself. And a third reading, stranger and more interesting, suggests that Arceus is not as singular as the myth implies, that what the creation myth describes as a single event of absolute creative power might in fact be a recurring pattern, something that happens again and again in a cycle whose full scope is not visible from inside the world it produces. These questions do not resolve, which is precisely why they have remained generative for as long as they have. The Pokemon world's relationship to its own mythology is one of the richest areas of theoretical exploration the franchise offers, and the Sinnoh creation myth is where that relationship is most directly accessible. The Ultra Beasts introduced in the Alola games represent the franchise's most explicit engagement with the question of what lies outside the Pokemon world, what other worlds might exist, and what happens when boundaries between them are crossed. They arrive as entities that do not fit the usual categories, whose threat comes not from power, though their power is considerable, but from foreignness, from the way they do not behave according to the rules that govern creatures native to the Pokemon world. The theories about Ultra Beasts ask questions about what their existence means for the cosmology of the franchise. If other worlds exist, worlds where life developed according to different rules, worlds where the category of Pokemon is not applicable, then the Pokemon world is not the universe but a universe, one of many possible arrangements of existence rather than the single arrangement. This is a significant shift in scale, and the games introduced it with an abruptness that felt to many players like a deliberate challenge to the assumptions the franchise had been building for 2 decades. The theory that certain Ultra Beasts have ecological analogs to native Pokemon, that the evolutionary pressures of their homeworlds produced creatures that independently arrived at similar solutions to similar problems, connects the Ultra Beasts back to the familiar in a way that makes them less alien rather than more. But the more interesting theories are the ones that do not try to domesticate the strangeness, that instead ask what it means for the franchise's history that entities this foreign exist, what their existence implies about the Pokemon world's relationship to whatever made it. The Ultra Wormholes, the dimensional breaches through which the Ultra Beasts travel, are described in terms that suggest they are not manufactured but natural, phenomena that occur under specific conditions rather than technology that was built to produce them. If they are natural, they have probably occurred throughout the Pokemon world's history, which means the boundary between the Pokemon world and other worlds has always been permeable. The ancient history of every region might include encounters with Ultra Beasts that were interpreted at the time as something else, as divine visitations or natural disasters, or the manifestations of forces whose true nature was beyond the interpretive frameworks available to the people who experienced them. The theory of Red as a figure distinct from the player, as a character with an interior that the games deliberately leave unexplored, has generated a particular kind of theoretical attention that is different from most Pokemon theories. Most theories ask about the world. This one asks about a person, about what it means to be the protagonist of a story that ends, and then to persist in that story as something other than the protagonist. Red appears at the summit of Mount Silver in gold and silver, silent, surrounded by exceptionally powerful Pokemon, existing at the highest accessible point in the region, as if he climbed until he ran out of world to climb through. He has no dialogue. He challenges the player to battle, and then, when the battle is over, disappears. The games do not tell you where he went, or what he was doing there, or what his presence in that location means. The theories that have grown from this encounter are among the more poignant in the Pokemon tradition because they ask questions about what completion means, about what happens to people who have achieved everything their world made available to them and are then left to figure out what comes after. Red climbed to the top of a mountain and waited. For what? For someone who could match him? For the world to offer him something new? For a reason to come back down? The silence that defines Red in his Mount Silver encounter is, in the theoretical tradition, the most meaningful thing about him. He had a journey that was complete, a world that was smaller than his capacity to explore it, a story that finished before he did. And in finishing before him, it left him in the place where the story ended, still there, still present, still waiting for a continuation that the franchise has approached and circled without ever fully providing. The theories about Red are, at their quietest, about what any of us do when the most important journey we can imagine is over, and we are still standing at the place it brought us. There are small things in the Pokemon games that have generated theories, not because they are dramatic, or because they connect to major elements of the franchise's lore, but simply because they are strange in ways that resist easy explanation. The presence of a single Mr. Mime outside a house in the original Kanto games, behaving as if it lives there, working as a domestic helper for the player's mother, raises a question that the games do not acknowledge as a question. How long has it been there? Why is it performing domestic labor? What is the nature of its relationship to the family whose house it maintains? The Mr. Mime outside the player's house has been theorized as everything from a Pokemon that was abandoned and found a home to a creature with a specific relationship to the player's mother that the games are carefully not specifying. These theories are gentle and a little bit absurd, which is part of what makes them appealing. They take a detail that was almost certainly placed for flavor and ask what it would mean if the flavor detail were the surface of something with more depth underneath. This quality, the willingness to treat any detail as potentially meaningful, is the foundation of all serious Pokemon theorizing. The franchise rewards this approach because it was built by people who were themselves thinking carefully about details, who put things in the games because those things seemed right, even if no one would notice them, because precision in world building has a way of generating meaning that exceeds what any individual detail was designed to carry. The Mr. Mime outside the house is probably just a charming visual joke. But in a world where almost everything else repays careful attention, the charming visual joke sits in productive proximity to questions it was never meant to raise. The mystery of Pokemon breeding has generated theories that sit at the intersection of biology, lore, and the particular strangeness of how the Pokemon world's reproductive logic actually works. The daycare, the egg cycles, the way certain Pokemon can only be obtained as eggs from parents of apparently unrelated species, these mechanics are functional within the game, but strange when taken seriously as descriptions of how living things actually produce offspring. The fact that most Pokemon breed through eggs, regardless of the biological improbability of an egg being produced by creatures as varied as a bear and a kangaroo, has been theorized as evidence that Pokemon are not biological in quite the way ordinary animals are, that the category differences between species are less fundamental than they appear, that what looks like wildly divergent biology is perhaps a single underlying template expressed in very different ways. The egg groups that govern breeding compatibility are the most direct evidence for this reading, the suggestion that something underneath the visible diversity of Pokemon connects creatures who look nothing like each other into the same reproductive category. The Ditto theory connects here in an interesting way. If Ditto is a failed Mew, and Mew is the common ancestor of all Pokemon, then Ditto's ability to breed with nearly any Pokemon might be a consequence of carrying the ancestral form, the common template that underlies all the specific expressions of Pokemon life. Breeding with Ditto would be, in this reading, not a biological oddity, but a return to origins, a connection to the underlying template that all the visible variety has departed from. The diversity of Pokemon life funnels back through Ditto to something more fundamental, and that fundamental thing is, in some sense, Mew. The theories about the Lavender Town music that circulated in the early history of the Pokemon internet represent a different kind of fan engagement than the theories about lore and design, one that is more concerned with affect than with explanation. The music of Lavender Town in the original Japanese release of Pokemon Red and Green was by any measure unusually unsettling for a game aimed primarily at children. Its tones carried a quality that distinguished them from the rest of the game's soundtrack, and players responded to that quality with the kind of attention that unusual sensory experiences generate. The theories that grew from this response were, in their most elaborate forms, claims about the music's psychoacoustic effects, about frequencies embedded in the original version that had measurable psychological impacts. These claims were fictional and never had any factual basis, but the fictional theories were compelling enough that they achieved a circulation that outran their origins in creative writing, eventually becoming the kind of story that people told, as if it were true, without knowing where they had first encountered it. What the Lavender Town theories actually demonstrate is something interesting about how Pokemon lore works in the community. The games produce strong affects, emotional responses that feel significant, even when they are produced by something as simple as a tune playing in the background of a location associated with death. When an affect is strong enough and unusual enough, the community generates explanations for it, stories that try to account for why the experience felt the way it did. The stories may not be true, but the affect they are responding to is real, and the attempt to explain it is a genuine act of engagement with something the games created. The music of Lavender Town is quieter now than it was in memory, the years softening what the original experience sharpened. But the response it generated, and the tradition of theorizing that grew from it, remain as evidence that the Pokemon world's emotional landscape is as rich and as worthy of attention as its lore and its design. The games make you feel things. Trying to understand why is not a misuse of attention, but exactly the right use of it. The concept of Pokemon evolution, distinct from biological evolution in its compression and immediacy, has generated theoretical examination that asks what the experience of evolving is actually like for the creature undergoing it. The games represent evolution as a visual transformation accompanied by light, a change of form that is apparently painless and that the evolving Pokemon seems in most cases to welcome, or at least not to resist. But the theoretical tradition asks whether the representation tells the whole story. Some Pokemon are prevented from evolving by their trainers, held at an earlier form either through the use of items or simply by not meeting the conditions that would trigger transformation. The games present this as a neutral option, a matter of preference and strategy. But the theory that evolution in Pokemon is not simply a physical change, but something more fundamental, a change in the creature's sense of itself, its understanding of what it is, asks what it would mean to prevent a creature from becoming what it is capable of becoming. The most interesting cases in this theoretical context are the Pokemon who seem to have complicated relationships with their own evolution, who delay or resist the process in ways that suggest it involves a loss as well as a gain. The transition from Haunter to Gengar, from Kadabra to Alakazam, involves a change in the creature's type distribution and stat profile that might correspond, in the world's logic, to a change in the creature's fundamental character. What Haunter loses in becoming Gengar, what Kadabra leaves behind in becoming Alakazam, are these things the creature wanted to leave behind? Did it choose the change, or did the change happen to it? The games provide mechanics, but not phenomenology, data, but not experience. And the gap between those two things is where the most interesting theoretical work happens. As the world grows still and the details of these theories begin to lose their edges, becoming something softer and less defined, there is a quality in the best Pokemon theories that is worth sitting with one more time before the night is fully done. It is the quality of care. Every theory, from the most elaborate cosmological reading of Arceus to the quietest observation about a Mr. Mime standing in a garden, reflects a kind of love for the world being theorized about, a willingness to give it attention that exceeds what it strictly requires, to treat it as something that deserves to be understood rather than simply used. This is not nothing. The world is large, and most of it asks more of us than it gives back. The worlds we build in games and stories and theories are smaller and more manageable, and they give back more than they ask, which is one reason people return to them. The Pokemon world has given back an enormous amount to the community that has attended to it so carefully, not just in the entertainment the games provide, but in the shared language of reference, in theory and memory that has accumulated around them over decades. The theories will continue to develop. New games will provide new details, new lacunae, new places where the surface and the depth diverge far enough to invite interpretation. New players will come to old games and see things that have not been noticed before, make connections that have not been made, ask questions that have not been asked. The tradition is not finished. It is ongoing, accumulating, building on itself in the way that all living traditions do. What remains at the end of this long drift through the theories and the questions and the quiet places where the franchise holds its most interesting silences is a feeling that is familiar to anyone who has spent time thinking carefully about the things they love. It is the feeling of a world that is larger than you can hold all at once, that gives you something new every time you return to it, that rewards the patience to look past the surface with discoveries that feel disproportionately significant for their size, a detail about weight, a silhouette that matches another silhouette, a rival standing in a tower for the dead, a trainer who mentioned a war, a legendary bird visible in the first minute of an anime that has lasted for decades. These things are small. They are also, in the particular logic of Pokemon, enormous, because the world they are embedded in is enormous, and the community that has spent 30 years thinking carefully about them has made them more enormous still. There is a Pokemon in the Johto games whose relationship to memory and cycles has always drawn a particular kind of reflection. Espeon and Umbreon, the light-responsive evolutions of Eevee introduced in the second generation, require not simply a certain happiness threshold, but a bond developed over time, tested by the specific quality of the moment in which that bond finally tips over into transformation. The morning light that makes Espeon and the evening dark that makes Umbreon are not merely mechanical triggers, but conditions that carry meaning, that connect the act of evolution to the rhythm of days and the specific emotional texture of a relationship between a trainer and a creature that has been cultivated with attention. The theory that the EVA evolutionary line as a whole represents something like potential itself, like the quality of openness to multiple futures before a particular future is chosen, has been part of Pokemon theorizing since the original games. Eevee is described as having a genetic code that is uniquely unstable, that responds to environmental pressures and emotional conditions and elemental exposure in ways that no other creatures does. The theory extends this instability into a statement about the nature of possibility, suggesting that Eevee is not a creature with a deficiency, but a creature in a state that most living things only pass through briefly, a state of genuine openness to what it might become. The evolutions in this reading are not simply a mechanic for player choice, but a philosophical taxonomy of different ways of resolving openness into particularity. Becoming the lightning creature, or the water creature, or the creature of darkness is not simply gaining a new form. It is the closing of other futures in order to inhabit one fully. And the creature that was Eevee, with all of its instability and potential, becomes something defined and specific and committed, trading the luxury of possibility for the richness of a particular existence. This theory has a quality that goes beyond Pokemon into territory that the franchise has always been willing to gesture at in its quieter moments. The question of what it means to choose one future out of many, what is lost, and what is gained in that choosing, is not a question children's media typically addresses directly. But Pokemon has always been comfortable with it in the particular way that things which begin as games can sometimes be comfortable with questions that are too serious for their apparent register. The way that Pokemon games handle the concept of legendary Pokemon has evolved across generations in ways that the theoretical tradition has found consistently interesting. In the original games, legendaries were rare and powerful, but relatively uncomplicated in their lore. They were the strongest creatures, available only through specific rituals or inaccessible locations, and their significance was primarily mechanical rather than narrative. But as the franchise developed, the legendary concept accumulated mythological weight that transformed the simple rarity of these creatures into something more philosophically complex. The legendary Pokemon of later generations are not simply very powerful rare creatures. They are entities connected to fundamental forces, to the creation and maintenance of the world, to the balance of opposites, to the continuation of time and the persistence of space. They are, in the theoretical tradition's most generous reading, the infrastructure of the Pokemon universe, the beings whose existence makes the ordinary existence of everything else possible. When legendaries appear in the main games, they are not simply powerful opponents to be overcome through careful preparation. They are disruptions in the background conditions of the world, moments when what ordinarily operates silently and invisibly becomes present and interactable. The theory that the capture of legendary Pokemon by trainers has cosmological consequences, that removing a Mewtwo from its environment or an Articuno from the mountain where it regulates temperature is not simply an acquisition, but an intervention in the systems those creatures maintain, gives the gameplay mechanics a moral weight that the games themselves do not explicitly address. When a player captures the legendary bird of the sea and places it in a PC box, what happens to the sea? When the Keeper of Time is locked in a ball and carried around by a 10-year-old, what happens to time? The games do not answer these questions because answering them would complicate the player's experience in ways that are difficult to incorporate into the genre's conventions. But the questions exist, and the theoretical tradition has generated many careful and interesting responses to them, most of which involve some form of the suggestion that the legendaries, once captured, continue their cosmic functions from inside their new arrangements, that the ball does not prevent the function but merely relocates the creature performing it. The universe continues, the time continues, the sea continues. But the evidence for this comfortable resolution is not in the games. It is in the necessity of believing it. There are Pokemon in every generation whose Pokedex entries describe capacities that, if taken seriously as descriptions of actual abilities rather than as flavor text, would fundamentally alter the power dynamics of the Pokemon world. Alakazam's 1,000+ IQ, Gardevoir's ability to create a small black hole, Machamp's ability to throw 1,000 punches in a single second, Shuckle's potential maximum damage output that exceeds any other creature in any game context. These are details that exist within the game's text, but that the game's mechanics only partially represent. The theory that the Pokédex consistently understates the power of the creatures it describes, or that the numbers and descriptions it offers are imprecise translations of phenomena that the authors of the entries did not fully understand, gives these extreme claims a different status. They are not mistakes or hyperbole, but attempts by limited observers to capture in ordinary language something that ordinary language is not quite adequate to. The Pokédex is, in this reading, always slightly wrong about the things it is trying to describe, not because the people writing it are careless, but because the things they are writing about exceed the categories available to them. This theory produces an interesting recontextualization of the entire game experience. The battles that players participate in are, from the perspective of the creatures involved, interactions that are shaped and limited by the specific context of being in a battle, by the social contract of the training relationship, by whatever the creatures have chosen to express in that context. What they are capable of, at their full extent, in conditions that have not been defined by the conventions of competitive battling, is something else entirely. The player is always encountering a constrained version of the creature, a presentation of power that is filtered through a context that both enables and limits it. There is one more quality of the Pokemon world that deserves attention before the night is fully over, one more dimension of what makes these games and the theories they have generated feel so persistently meaningful. It is the quality of scale, of the way the world manages to be simultaneously very large and very intimate, simultaneously concerned with cosmological forces and with the specific detail of a small creature trying to exist with dignity in a world that is, from any individual perspective, enormous. The best Pokemon theories hold this quality. The theory about Blue's Raticate is not about the world's cosmology. It is about a single creature and the person who lost it, and what that loss meant in the context of a journey that was supposed to be about becoming the best. The theory about Red at the top of Mount Silver is not about the nature of legendary Pokemon. It is about a person at the end of something, standing in a place that represents completion, trying to understand what comes next. These are intimate theories about intimate things, and they are intimate precisely because the games are intimate, because the franchise at its core is about the relationship between a person and the creatures they choose to travel with, and that relationship is always personal, even when the stakes are cosmological. There is a Pokemon in the Alola region whose design carries a weight that most players feel without being able to immediately articulate the source of that feeling. Mimikyu is a creature that hides its true form beneath a hand-drawn disguise, a cloth shaped to resemble the most recognizable Pokemon in the franchise's history. The disguise is imprecise, made without the tools that precision requires, assembled from whatever was available by something that wanted more than anything else to be seen the way Pikachu is seen, to be liked, to be approached rather than fled from. The Pokédex entries that describe Mimikyu are among the more quietly devastating in the franchise. They describe a creature so undesirable to look at that the sight of it causes physical harm, a creature whose actual body is so far outside what the world finds acceptable that it constructed an entire false self to present in its place. They describe the Pikachu disguise not as a manipulation, but as a hope, a genuine belief that if you look enough like the thing that everyone loves, some of that love might fall on you by proximity. The theory that Mimikyu's tragedy is not just aesthetic, but existential asks what it would mean to live permanently behind a face you did not choose, to move through the world presenting something you're not, because what you actually are is too dangerous to present. It asks whether the love Mimikyu receives through its disguise is real love or a transferred sentiment, whether being liked for a performance of yourself counts as being liked at all. These questions sit in the game's text without being asked directly, offered to any player willing to stay with the Pokédex entries long enough to let their implications settle. What makes Mimikyu theoretically interesting beyond the surface melancholy of its design is the question of what it is under the cloth. The games are deliberate about not showing this, preserving the creature's true appearance as a mystery that may never be resolved. And that preservation is itself meaningful, a decision to protect something by keeping it unseen, which is exactly what Mimikyu is doing for itself. The games extend the same courtesy to the creature that the creature extends to the world, a kindness shaped like an absence. The question of what Team Rocket actually wants, beyond the surface ambition of world domination and the more specific ambition of acquiring powerful Pokemon, has generated theoretical analysis that finds more complexity in the organization's goals than the villainous framing of the games and anime might suggest. Giovanni, the figure who leads Team Rocket throughout the Kanto saga, is presented as ruthless and intelligent, capable of commanding loyalty from large numbers of operatives, pursuing a vision whose full scope the games never entirely disclose. The theory that Team Rocket's activities in the games reflect a coherent economic and political strategy, rather than simply a generic criminal enterprise, finds support in the specific nature of the organization's operations. They do not simply steal Pokemon at random. They experiment on them. They attempt to enhance them, to push the limits of what Pokemon are capable of. They pursue the development of a creature so powerful it functions as a weapon. These activities, so taken together, suggest an organization interested not in the accumulation of wealth for its own sake, but in the accumulation of a specific kind of power, one that operates through the control of forces that the existing political structures of the Pokemon world cannot match. The connections between Team Rocket's Mewtwo project and the existing legendary Pokemon structure of the world raise further questions. If Giovanni's goal was to create a Pokemon more powerful than any other, and if legendary Pokemon are the entities that maintain the fundamental conditions of the world, then the Mewtwo project was not simply a weapons development program, but an attempt to create something that would give its possessor a leverage point over the world's most fundamental systems, not just powerful in battle, but cosmologically significant, not just capable of defeating other Pokemon, but capable of changing what the world is. This reading makes Giovanni's ambitions more coherent and more chilling than the cartoon villain framing allows. It places Team Rocket in a lineage of organizations, magma and aqua and galactic and plasma, each of which is also pursuing a kind of cosmological leverage, each of which has decided that the world as it exists is insufficient and requires replacement by something that their vision controls. The theories that connect these organizations into a pattern find in that pattern something about the recurring structure of Pokemon's villains, who are not simply greedy or cruel, but motivated by a specific relationship to the world's fundamental conditions that the protagonist must counteract. There is a Pokemon that appears in the original Kanto games in a single location, requiring a specific sequence of actions to encounter, and whose presence in the game has generated theoretical analysis disproportionate to the brevity of the encounter itself. The fossil Pokemon of Kanto occupy a specific narrative space, creatures restored from ancient forms, brought forward in time to exist in a present that does not entirely know what to do with them, but there is one among the original roster whose situation carries a particular kind of strangeness. Porygon is a Pokemon that was created entirely through programming, assembled from code rather than biology, existing in a form that is simultaneously a creature and a program, simultaneously present in the physical world and constituted by digital information, in a way that no other Pokemon in the original games shares. It can be acquired in a location that suggests rarity and value, and its Pokédex entries describe it as the first artificial Pokemon, an entity brought into existence not through natural processes, but through a decision by human designers to make something that had not existed before. The theories about Porygon ask questions about what kind of existence its particular form of being constitutes. If Pokemon are living things, and if living things are defined by the processes of biology, what is Porygon? It does not eat in the biological sense. It does not sleep in the biological sense. Its continued existence depends on the persistence of the code that constitutes it, which means it faces a kind of mortality that is categorically different from the mortality of creatures whose existence depends on biological processes. A Porygon that is deleted is gone in a way that a Pokemon that dies is not, because the death of a biological Pokemon leaves physical residues, while the deletion of a digital entity leaves nothing. The subsequent development of Porygon into Porygon 2 and Porygon Z adds layers to this thinking. The evolution of a digital Pokemon requires not the biological pressures that drive natural evolution, but deliberate modification, human intervention in the code that constitutes the creature. Porygon Z's entry describes a Pokemon that was modified to operate in alien dimensions, and that the modifications introduced instabilities, behavioral unpredictability, a form of digital psychological distress. The theory that Porygon Z's erratic behavior represents a form of suffering caused by modifications the creature did not consent to and cannot fully integrate is one of the darker readings available in the franchise, all the more so because the games present it in entries that are calm and matter-of-fact, as if the distress of a digital entity is an ordinary observation rather than a troubling one. The geography of Unova has generated theoretical analysis that connects the region's design to specific real-world contexts in ways that the franchise's other regions invite but never pursue as directly. Every Pokemon region is loosely modeled on a real geographic area, and the connections between the game world and the source geography are usually understood as aesthetic rather than thematic. But Unova's black and white games were the first mainline games developed with an explicitly international market as a primary audience, and that orientation left marks in the design that theorists have found worth examining. The theory that Unova's structure reflects something specific about the real-world context it models, rather than simply borrowing visual inspiration from it, finds its most interesting evidence in the thematic concerns that dominate the black and white games. The question of exploitation and liberation, The debate about whether the relationship between Pokemon and trainers is fundamentally harmful, the presence of an antagonist who frames his destructive project as a moral crusade. These are concerns that carry different weights in different cultural contexts, and the theoretical tradition has asked what it means that they were foregrounded in the games that were most explicitly designed to cross cultural boundaries. The black and white games ask their moral questions with more directness than any previous games in the franchise, presenting the player with a genuine argument against the core premise of the series and requiring them to engage with that argument rather than simply dismiss it. N is not wrong that Pokemon are sometimes exploited. He is wrong about the conclusions he draws from that observation, but the observation itself is valid, and the games take the time to make it credibly. This willingness to entertain a serious critique of the franchise's own premise is unusual enough that it deserves attention, and the theoretical tradition has given it considerable attention, finding in it evidence of a design philosophy that was willing to make players uncomfortable in the service of a more honest engagement with the world the games had been building for over a decade. The concept of shiny Pokemon, the rare variant forms that appear in different colors than their standard counterparts, has generated theoretical analysis that asks what the existence of these variants means within the world, rather than simply how they function as a mechanic. The games introduce shininess as a random variation, a small chance that any wild Pokemon encountered will appear in colors different from the norm, and the rarity of the encounter is what makes shiny Pokemon valuable to players. But the theoretical tradition has asked what the creatures themselves might represent. The theory that shiny Pokemon are not simply color variants, but something more fundamental, that the color difference indicates a form of difference that extends beyond appearance, has appeared in multiple forms across the franchise's theoretical community. Some versions of this theory connect shininess to specific ecological or evolutionary pressures, suggesting that the rare color variant indicates a Pokemon that has developed along a different path from its species norm, perhaps adapted to unusual environments or dietary conditions that produced a different pigmentation as a side effect. Others suggest that the difference is genetic in a more profound sense, that shiny Pokemon are members of a lineage that has been isolated from the main population long enough to develop genuine distinctions. The most interesting versions of this theory focus on the emotional and social dimensions of being a shiny Pokemon within the game world. If color variant Pokemon are visibly different from every other member of their species, they would be recognizable in any crowd, immediately identifiable as unusual. This visibility would have consequences in the wild, affecting predator-prey dynamics in ways that could be beneficial or harmful depending on the specific ecology. A shiny Butterfree whose wing pattern is different from every other Butterfree in the forest either blends poorly into its environment or stands out as a warning, depending on the predators it faces. A shiny Gyarados whose red coloration is different from the standard blue would be instantly recognizable by any fisherman in any lake. A creature whose distinctive appearance would generate legend and story in ways that ordinary Gyarados would not. The red Gyarados encountered in the Johto games provides the franchise's most explicit engagement with this idea. It is not simply a rare encounter or a mechanic demonstration. It is a creature whose unusual appearance has made it the center of attention and the object of Team Rocket's interest, a Pokemon whose visibility has made it a target. The theory that shininess in Pokemon is a doubled condition, simultaneously making a creature more remarkable and more vulnerable, finds its clearest textual support in that single encounter, which the games treat not as a random variation, but as an event with consequences. The legendary Pokemon associated with the concepts of time and space in the Sinnoh games have generated theories about what it would mean for the world if the entities governing these fundamental conditions were absent, threatened, or in conflict. Dialga and Palkia are described not simply as very powerful creatures, but as the forces that allow time and space to function, whose existence is constitutive of the conditions that make ordinary existence possible. Without Dialga, time would stop. Without Palkia, space would collapse. These are not metaphors in the game's mythology. They are presented as literal descriptions of dependency. The theory that the Sinnoh game's villainous scheme is the most genuinely terrifying in the franchise because it operates at a level that makes all other Pokémon villainous schemes look small by comparison finds considerable support in this dependency. Team Galactic's plan involves the destruction of the current universe and the creation of a new one shaped by their leader's vision. This is not simply world domination in the sense of gaining political control over existing systems. It is the elimination of everything that exists in favor of something that does not yet exist, a creative destruction on the grandest possible scale. The theoretical analysis of Cyrus, the leader of Team Galactic, finds in his motivations something more psychologically complex than standard villain material. He describes the world's imperfections in terms that reference his own emotional experience, suggesting that the cosmic destruction he pursues is connected to a personal history that the games only gesture at. The theory that Cyrus's desire to create a universe without spirit, a world cleansed of the emotional and relational dimensions of existence, is a response to his specific history, rather than a detached philosophical conclusion, gives his villainy a tragic quality that the games support without emphasizing. He is not wrong that the world contains suffering. He has concluded from this observation that the solution is the elimination of the conditions that make experience possible, and the theory that this conclusion reflects a particular kind of emotional damage, rather than a logical error, changes the nature of his threat. There are locations in Pokémon games that have generated sustained theoretical attention, not because of specific lore connected to them, but because of the quality of atmosphere they produce, the feeling of wrongness or weight they carry that seems to exceed what the games explicitly justify. These locations are distributed across the franchise, but tend to cluster in regions where the designers were most willing to allow darkness to persist without resolution. The Lost Cave in the Fire Red and Leaf Green games is one of these locations. It is a cave that functions as a maze, in which the path you need to take to progress is not determined by visible navigational cues, but by arbitrary left and right decisions, any of which may return you to that entrance without warning. The cave contains a child who has wandered inside and cannot find her way out. The atmosphere of the location is simple but effective, a combination of the maze mechanic's disorientation and the specific detail of a lost child that gives the location a quality that stays with players longer than the cave's brevity might suggest. The theoretical analysis of the Lost Cave asks what it represents within the world. A cave that disorients everyone who enters it, that contains a child who should not be there and cannot leave, located in a region that has its own history of death and absence, generates questions about the geography of the Pokémon world that go beyond the functional. The theory that certain locations in the Pokémon world are shaped by the events that took place in them, that places accumulate history in ways that affect their atmosphere, connects the Lost Cave to the broader theoretical tradition of reading the Pokémon world's geography as a record of what happened there, rather than simply a setting for what is happening now. Mount Your Pyre in the Hoenn games occupies a similar space, a mountain where Pokémon are laid to rest, where the old couple at the summit were the guardians of an object whose loss set the game's crisis in motion. The mountain's atmosphere combines genuine melancholy with the particular quality of a place that takes its custodial function seriously, where the rituals of mourning are performed with care and continuity. The theory that Mount Pyre and Lavender Tower represent two different cultural responses to the same fundamental challenge, of what to do with the dead and what obligations the living carry toward them, finds in the comparison something about the Pokemon world's relationship to mortality that the games acknowledge without foregrounding. The relationship between Pokemon and their names, between the word used to refer to a creature and the creature itself, has generated theoretical analysis that asks whether naming in the Pokemon world carries a different weight than naming in ours. Players can nickname their Pokemon, replacing the species name with a personal identifier that the game registers and uses going forward. This mechanic is presented as a customization option, a way of personalizing the experience. But the theoretical tradition has asked what nicknaming means within the world's logic. The theory that Pokemon names are not simply labels, but something closer to a form of relationship, that the name a trainer gives their Pokemon reflects and shapes the nature of the bond between them, connects the naming mechanic to the broader question of what trainers and Pokemon are to each other. A Pokemon referred to by its species name remains in a more general relationship to its trainer, identified as a type of thing rather than as an individual. A Pokemon with a personal name has been individuated, recognized as this particular creature rather than a representative of its species, given an identity that is specific rather than categorical. The evolution mechanics that respond to happiness and friendship add another layer to this thinking. Pokemon that evolve through friendship, creatures like Eevee's Espeon and Umbreon forms, or the line that produces Togekiss, require not simply that the trainer have spent time with them, but that the time spent has produced a particular quality of bond. The games measure this through a happiness statistic that responds to being healed, to walking together, to avoiding the fainting that represents battle defeat. The theory that nicknaming a Pokemon affects this happiness statistic in ways the game does not explicitly describe has never been confirmed, but it resonates with the game's broader logic, which treats the relationship between trainer and Pokemon as something that is cultivated through consistent, specific attention rather than simply accumulated through time. The question of what the Safari Zone is, within the logic of the Pokemon world, has generated theories that range from the practical to the troubling. The Safari Zone is a reserve where wild Pokemon can be encountered under controlled conditions, where trainers use special equipment rather than their own Pokemon to attempt captures, where the normal rules of Pokemon combat do not apply. The framing of the games presents it as a conservation area, a protected space where endangered species can exist without the pressures of ordinary wild environments. But the theoretical analysis of the Safari Zone asks questions about its economic structure that the games do not address. There is an entry fee. The captures that happen inside the zone's boundaries are legal and permanent, with caught Pokemon sent to the player's storage system in the same way that wild captures function everywhere else. The zone is accessible to any trainer who can pay the fee, regardless of that trainer's relationship with the Pokemon they are attempting to capture. These details suggest an institution that is simultaneously a conservation space and a commercial enterprise, serving the interests of both the Pokemonity houses and the trainers who pay to hunt them. The theory that the Safari Zone represents a specific kind of uncomfortable compromise, where the language of conservation is used to justify an ongoing extraction that benefits both the zone's operators and the trainers who participate in it, finds support in the details of how the zone functions. The Pokemon inside the zone do not choose to be there. Their containment is presented as beneficial, but the benefit is measured in terms of the species' survival rather than the individual creature's freedom. The theoretical tradition has asked whether a world that treats the individual freedom of creatures as negotiable in service of species-level goals is consistent with the values that the franchise generally presents itself as endorsing, and has found the question more complicated than the games seem to want it to be. There is a mechanic in the Pokemon games that players interact with so frequently it becomes invisible, and whose implications the theoretical tradition has found worth making visible again. The Pokemon Center is a building present in every town and city across every region, staffed by a nurse whose function is the complete restoration of any Pokemon brought to her, regardless of the nature or severity of the damage they have sustained. This service is free, unlimited, and immediate. The games present it as infrastructure, as a feature of the world rather than a mystery within it. But the theoretical analysis of the Pokemon Center asks what the free, unlimited healing implies about the political economy of the Pokemon world. Who funds these buildings? Who trains the staff? Who provides the resources that make complete restoration possible at no cost to the trainer? The games do not answer these questions, but the questions themselves reveal assumptions embedded in the game's design that the theoretical tradition has found interesting to examine. The theory that the existence of Pokemon centers reflects a specific political philosophy that the games endorse without naming directly suggests that the Pokemon world's treatment of health and healing as a public good rather than a commodity carries ideological weight. In a world where anyone can walk into any Pokemon Center and have their partners restored for free, the barriers to participation in Pokemon training are primarily about skill and commitment rather than resources. The egalitarianism of this system is not presented as an achievement or as the product of specific political choices. It is simply how the world works. And the theory asks what it means that the games take this as a baseline, treating unlimited access to healing as so ordinary it requires no explanation. The contrast with the real-world systems that the franchise emerged from, with the healthcare and veterinary systems that most of the franchise's global audience navigates, gives this theoretical analysis a dimension that exceeds the game world. The Pokemon Center is a small piece of world building that carries, if you look at it carefully, a quiet argument about how a world could be organized, embedded so naturally in the game's infrastructure that it is easy to receive as description rather than prescription. The ghost that waits in the old chateau in the Sinnoh games is one of the franchise's quieter mysteries, embedded in an optional location that players can visit but are not required to enter in the course of the main game. The old chateau is a ruined manor house, its rooms dusty and its atmosphere heavy with a specific quality of absence, the sense of something that was once inhabited and is no longer. The optional encounters available within it, rare Pokemon that cannot be found anywhere else in the region, are accompanied by environmental storytelling that the games deliver through the location's design rather than through dialogue. The theory about what happened in the old chateau constructs a narrative from the visual details the games provide. There is a portrait that moves. There are rooms that contain furniture, suggesting the presence of people who are no longer there. And there are ghostly apparitions, not the ghost-type Pokemon that can be caught in the location, but visual phenomena that appear to be something else, something the game does not name or explain. These apparitions have the appearance of a young girl and of an older man, and they vanish when approached, and the games offer no lore to explain what they are or what happened to the people they might represent. The theoretical tradition has built several narratives from these details, most of them involving loss in some form, a family that lived in the manor and something that went wrong, a history of the location that the visual evidence suggests without confirming. What makes these theories interesting is not the specific narratives they construct, but the method they use. Reading a location the way you would read a text, treating visual details as evidence of a story the game decided not to tell directly. This method is characteristic of the best Pokemon theorizing, which has always treated the games as documents that contain more than their surfaces announce. The relationship between Pokemon legends and the Pokemon that appear in games has generated theoretical analysis that asks whether the legends in the game world describe real events or whether they are, like the legends in our world, stories that encode real concerns in fictional forms. The distinction matters because the Pokemon world contains entities that could plausibly be the sources of any legend its cultures might generate. When a legend describes a creature that controlled the sea, the question of whether that creature is mythological or historical is genuinely open in a way that it is not in our world. The Cianwood City area of Johto contains a pharmacy that makes a specific medicine available to the player, a medicine whose origin is described in terms that reference local knowledge and traditional practice. The theoretical analysis of traditional knowledge in the Pokemon world asks what it means that healing practices derived from Pokemon have persisted through human cultures in ways that suggest a long history of observation and accumulation. The theory that the relationship between humans and Pokemon extends back much further than the contemporary trainer culture the games primarily portray, that there were forms of coexistence and cooperation that preceded the Pokeball and the gym system, and the competitive structure that dominates the present finds support in details like this one. The ruins scattered across every region are the most visible evidence of this deeper history, structures that predate the contemporary culture by centuries or millennia, whose original function the games describe in partial terms through archaeologists and scholars who are themselves working from incomplete records. The theory that the Pokemon world's ancient history involved a fundamentally different relationship between humans and Pokemon, one in which the distinction between the two was less clearly defined or differently organized than it is in the present, uses these ruins as its primary evidence. The ruins of Alph in Johto, the Salacion ruins in Sinnoh, the Abyssal ruins in Unova, each of these locations carries fragments of a history that the game suggests is important without providing the tools to fully understand it. There is a species of Pokemon that has generated more philosophical analysis than almost any other, not because of its power or its rarity or its connections to the franchise's larger mythological structure, but because of the specific nature of what its Pokédex entries describe it doing. Shedinja is a hollow husk Pokemon that appears as a byproduct of Nincada's evolution, an entity that comes into existence not through the normal processes of growth and transformation, but as a remainder, something left behind when the main evolution takes place. Its design is that of a shed shell, an empty cicada casing given independent existence and movement. The entries that describe Shedinja state that it has no heartbeat and does not breathe, that it does not move in any visible way, and that looking through the hole in its back will steal your soul. These are claims of unusual specificity, even by the standards of a franchise whose entries regularly describe extraordinary capacities as matter-of-fact observations. And the theoretical tradition has asked what each of them means, taken seriously within the game's world. The theory that Shedinja is not alive in any conventional sense, that it is a category of entity the game's existing frameworks do not fully accommodate, asks whether the concepts of health and damage that govern the game's combat system apply to it in the same way they apply to other Pokemon. Shedinja has exactly one hit point. It cannot be brought below this threshold by direct damage from moves against which it is not immune, because it has an ability that prevents this. But any move of a type it is not immune to would theoretically be lethal in a single hit. The theory that this mechanic is not simply a design choice, but reflects something about Shedinja's nature as an entity, that it occupies a state so precarious that the slightest contact with the wrong kind of force would end whatever it is, gives the mechanic a weight that goes beyond strategy. The soul-stealing aspect of its Pokédex entry has generated the most sustained theoretical attention because it implies a relationship between Shedinja and the concept of consciousness or vital force that the games do not develop but clearly intend as significant. The hole in its back is not simply a design feature, but an aperture that connects to something, and what it connects to and what it takes from those who look into it are questions that the games raise and decline to answer. The theoretical tradition has filled this silence with readings that range from the mechanical to the genuinely unsettling, most of them converging on the suggestion that Shedinja occupies the boundary between existence and non-existence, maintaining its hollow presence in the world through processes that the framework of ordinary Pokemon biology cannot explain. As the theories accumulate and the night deepens further, there is a particular quality in the experience of sustained Pokemon theorizing that deserves acknowledgement. It is the quality of finding that a world you thought you knew completely still contains things you had not noticed, that familiarity and knowledge are not the same thing, that having played a game many times does not mean you have seen everything that is available to be seen in it. This experience is one that the franchise has cultivated deliberately through a design philosophy that embeds more than it announces, that places details in locations where only certain players will find them, that builds implications into mechanics and lore that are available to anyone who looks, but that require looking to find. The theoretical tradition is the organized form of this looking, the community's collective attempt to see everything the games contain, rather than simply the things the games foreground. What the theories produce, at their best, is not certainty but orientation. They do not tell you what the games definitively mean. They tell you what the games could mean, what the details that are present in them are capable of supporting, what kinds of stories the evidence is consistent with. This interpretive humility is characteristic of the best work in the tradition, which tends to present its readings as possibilities rather than conclusions, as invitations to further looking rather than terminations of inquiry. The franchise has been generous with these invitations across more than 3 decades of games, and the theoretical tradition that has grown in response to them reflects something genuine about the relationship between the games and the community that plays them. The games were made to be played, but also, it turns out, to be read. And the reading has produced a body of thought that is itself a kind of creation, a collaborative work built by thousands of players who found in the games a world worth understanding as carefully as any world deserves to be understood. The legendary event Pokemon distributed through real-world promotions have generated their own body of theoretical analysis, distinct from the theories about in-game mechanics and lore, because these creatures occupy an unusual position in the franchise's structure. They are canon, fully part of the game world's mythology, but accessible only through participation in events that the games themselves cannot provide. They come from outside the games, arriving through distributions that are temporary and that a player who does not participate in at the right time can never access through ordinary means. The theory about what event Pokemon represent within the world asks what it means that the most mythologically significant creatures, the ones whose lore connects them to the deepest levels of the world's cosmological structure, are also the ones most difficult to legitimately obtain. Arceus, the creator of the world, was originally available only through an event item. Darkrai, a creature described as causing unavoidable nightmares, was similarly restricted. The theory suggests that this inaccessibility is not simply a marketing decision, though it may also be that, but a reflection of something about the nature of these entities within the world's mythology. What is most fundamental is also most rare. What is most powerful is also most absent. The creator of everything is also the thing most difficult to encounter. The later games' tendency to make previously event-exclusive Pokemon accessible through in-game means reflects a shift in this philosophy, a recognition that mythology should be accessible to anyone who engages with the world, rather than only to those who participate in the specific commercial and promotional structures surrounding the franchise. The theoretical tradition has read this shift as a statement about the relationship between the world and the players who inhabit it, a movement toward a more egalitarian conception of who gets to access the most significant elements of the world's story. There is a Pokemon whose very existence raises questions about consciousness and identity that the franchise approaches with more directness than it usually allows. Mewtwo is the most thoroughly documented artificial Pokemon in the franchise, its creation detailed through journal entries in the original games, its inner life explored in the first Pokemon film, its experience of its own existence used as the emotional foundation for a story about what it means to be created for a purpose you did not choose. The theoretical analysis of Mewtwo asks questions that the films and games raise without fully answering. What does it mean to have been made rather than born? Does the manner of origin affect the nature of the entity that results? If a Pokemon is created from the genetic material of another Pokemon, is it a member of the same species or something new, an entity that shares a lineage without sharing a history? Mewtwo's entries and appearances suggest a creature that is simultaneously continuous with its source material, sharing abilities and a basic genetic identity with Mew, and categorically different from it, shaped by the manner of its creation into something that does not fit the categories available to the world that made it. The theory that Mewtwo's most significant characteristic is not its power, but its consciousness, that what makes it threatening is not what it can do, but that it knows what it is, and what was done to it, connects the creature to the broader question of what awareness means in the Pokemon world. Most Pokemon are depicted as experiencing the world in ways that the games do not give us direct access to. Mewtwo is the exception, the Pokemon whose inner life is most directly available to the audience, and that availability is what makes it so theoretically rich. A creature that knows it was made, knows what it was made for, and has the power to refuse that purpose, is a figure that raises questions about free will and determination that the franchise handles with more seriousness in Mewtwo's case than in almost any other. The concept of held items in Pokemon, objects that creatures can carry in battle and that produce mechanical effects, has generated theoretical analysis that asks what these objects represent within the world rather than simply what they do in the game. The most interesting cases are the items that Pokemon carry in the wild, objects that are not placed on them by trainers, but that they are found carrying when encountered, whose presence on a wild creature raises questions about how it came to have them. The wild Pokemon that carry rare objects in the games are not described in most cases as having sought those objects out. They simply have them, found with them the way a wild animal might be found with a scar or a marking that indicates an encounter no observer witnessed. The theory that wild Pokemon hold specific items for reasons that the games describe through their Pokédex entries asks what it means that certain creatures are associated with certain objects in ways that seem natural rather than incidental. Lickitung and Lickilicky are described in entries that mention their sensitivity to taste, their tendency to lick everything they encounter, their particular relationship to the objects they interact with through that sensory modality. The items associated with them in the wild are consistent with this description, objects chosen in a way that reflects the creature's sensory world rather than assigned arbitrarily. The theory that wild Pokemon's held items are evidence of their behavior and ecology, that the presence of a specific item on a wild creature is a clue to how that creature moves through and interacts with its environment, treats the mechanic as world building rather than simply game design, and finds in it a richer picture of the Pokemon world's ecology than the encounter mechanics alone would suggest. There is one last direction that the theoretical tradition has consistently moved toward and then paused before, a direction that leads toward questions that are not about the world, but about the relationship between the world and the players who inhabit it. These are the theories that ask not what is true within the world of Pokemon, but what it means that we care about what is true there, what it says about us, that we have spent decades constructing interpretive frameworks for a franchise that is, at one level, a series of games made for children. The answer that the theoretical tradition most frequently arrives at is the same answer that applies to any sustained imaginative engagement with a fictional world. The caring is not separate from what is being cared about. The attention we bring to the Pokemon world reflects something genuine about our relationship to the questions the world raises, which are not only questions about Pokemon, but questions about loss and growth and grief and what it means to form bonds with other beings. The theories that find tragedy in Blue's rivalry, or loneliness in Red's vigil, or hope in Ash's perpetual beginning, are using the Pokemon world to think about things that matter beyond the Pokemon world, finding in a game about collecting creatures a set of tools for approaching questions that are difficult to approach directly. This is what the best storytelling has always done, and the theoretical tradition around Pokemon is part of the evidence that the franchise has achieved something more than competent game design. It has created a world that people care about enough to read carefully, to argue about, to return to across decades of changing circumstances, finding in it something that continues to repay the attention they bring. The theories will continue as long as the franchise continues, and probably longer, because the questions they are asking are not specific to any particular game or generation, but are the perennial questions that appear wherever human beings find worlds worth inhabiting with their imagination. There is a Pokemon introduced in the Johto games that has generated quiet, consistent theoretical attention because its Pokedex entries describe a form of memory and loss that sits at the intersection of several of the franchise's most persistent themes. Misdreavus is a ghost-type Pokemon that is described as wandering at night, crying out in the dark, startling sleeping people with its wails. But the entries that describe why it cries are the ones that carry the most theoretical weight. Misdreavus cries because it feeds on fear, but also because it is itself afraid, because its own wailing frightens it, because the sound it makes is both weapon and wound, both something it does to others and something it experiences in the doing. The theory that Misdreavus represents a form of grief that has turned self-sustaining, that has become something the creature both inflicts and suffers, connects the Pokemon to the broader tradition of ghost-type entries that describe creatures whose existence is defined by a loss they cannot resolve. The ghost types of Johto extend and complicate the ghost types of Kanto, adding new layers to the question of what haunting means and what it costs the haunter as well as the haunted. Misdreavus crying in the night, frightening itself with its own voice, carries in that small detail a picture of grief that is also self-perpetuating, a mourning that cannot end because the act of mourning generates the conditions that require further mourning. This reading is available in the entry text without being required by it, which is characteristic of the best Pokemon lore. The entry describes what Misdreavus does. The theory asks what doing it is like, and the gap between the description and the experience is where the most interesting theoretical work, as always, happens. The question of what the Pokemon world's human cultures believe about the creatures they share the world with has generated theoretical analysis that finds in the game's incidental lore a picture of a civilization shaped by coexistence in ways that go deeper than the surface-level friendship and competition the game's foreground. Every town contains people who talk about Pokemon, and those conversations, taken together, form a picture of a society that has been living alongside extraordinary creatures for long enough that the extraordinary has become ordinary in specific and interesting ways. The theory that the Pokemon world's folk wisdom and superstition reflects a genuine history of careful observation, that the things ordinary people in Pokemon games believe about specific creatures are not simply flavor text, but the accumulated knowledge of generations of coexistence, treats the incidental dialogue as primary source material for a picture of the world that the main narrative does not directly provide. An old man in a city who talks about seeing a particular Pokemon when he was young, a woman who warns against a certain location because of what lives there, a child who knows a rhyme about a legendary creature. These are fragments of a living oral tradition, knowledge about the world passed down through ordinary human channels, rather than through the formal structures of Pokemon research and gym culture. This reading gives the world of Pokemon a depth that the game's primary focus on the trainer's journey does not always access. The trainer moves through a world that has existed for a long time and that has developed responses to the challenges and wonders of Pokemon coexistence that are sophisticated and culturally specific. The theoretical tradition that takes this incidental knowledge seriously finds in it a world that is more fully human than the game's plot-driven structure usually has time to show. As the night reaches its deepest point, and the theories have settled into something soft and residual, there is a quality in the world of Pokemon that is worth naming one final time before sleep takes the last of these thoughts with it. It is the quality of a world that was made with love by people who cared deeply about what they were making, who put more into it than the commercial and functional requirements strictly demanded. That excess of care is what the theoretical tradition has been responding to across all these years and all these interpretations. Every detail that rewards careful attention, every connection that repays patient observation, every entry that carries implications beyond its stated content is evidence of people who were thinking about their work more carefully than they needed to, who considered what their choices meant rather than simply what they would do, who built a world that was worth inhabiting at multiple levels simultaneously. That could be a simple adventure for a child picking up a game for the first time, and a rich philosophical landscape for anyone willing to stay with it long enough to find the depth. There is something in the very structure of a franchise built on the idea that the world is full of things not yet discovered, not yet named, not yet understood, that invites the kind of attention the theoretical tradition has given it. Every new game is, at one level, a confirmation that there is more to find, more to learn, more to wonder about. Every new region is another part of a world that has always been larger than any single journey through it could reveal, and every new Pokemon added to the roster is a small proof that the world has not finished generating things worth noticing. The theories about what already exists are accompanied in every generation by speculation about what might exist next, what the games have not yet said, what directions the ongoing mythology might travel. This forward-looking dimension of Pokemon theorizing is as rich as the backward-looking variety, because the world that has been built across 3 decades contains patterns and implications that suggest futures as clearly as they suggest histories. The franchise is not finished, the theories are not finished, the night is not finished, though it is growing later, and the questions that remain are the ones that rest most comfortably in the dark, the ones that do not demand resolution, that are content to exist as open possibilities in a world that has always been generous with possibility. The world of Pokemon began with one person's vision of pocket-sized companions and has become something that belongs to everyone who has ever cared about it. It contains the work of thousands of designers and writers and artists across decades, and it contains equally the work of the community that has engaged with it, expanded it through interpretation and fan creation, kept it alive between games through the specific kind of love that manifests as careful, sustained attention. The theories are part of that work. This night of listening to them is part of that work. And whatever comes next, in the games and in the community, will be built on a foundation that includes all of this. The theories are the community's way of saying thank you for that care, of matching the attention given with attention returned, of honoring the work by engaging with it as seriously as it deserves. They are not peripheral to the experience of Pokemon, but central to it, the natural result of giving people a world that is worth reading and then watching what they do with it. What they do is this: they look closely, they find connections, they ask questions, and they share what they find with anyone who is still awake and willing to listen. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.